Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild sourcebook Malar, the Beastlord Compendium by James Welch for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to my platinum patrons Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, and Rivzung, and gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos David Vicente, Gilberto, Sean AK, Cert2B, Adam, Deadly Lizard Lounge, and Sam. Thank you all very much for your support. Malar is one of the gods in the Forgotten Realms universe. That's about the extent of my knowledge going into this. A god of the hunt is not an unheard of thing in fantasy universes in general. In fact, I believe that's like the subtitle of the whole Witcher 3 game. I don't really know much about Malar going into this, other than usually the god of worshipped by a lot of lycanthropes. So werewolves and were-tigers and were-bears. Oh my, kind of a thing. This source book has over 100 pages of content, and source books are usually pretty big. Half of that is pure background information. It is lore, it's history, it's geography, it's culture surrounding the cult of Malar specifically. If you ever wanted to know basically anything about the cultists or the tenets or the doctrines or the chants or poems, that's all included in here in the first 50 pages. The second half is the actual mechanical stuff, which is the new player options, and we get 2 new subclasses, and I think about a dozen feats, over a dozen new spells and magic items, a bunch of new creature stat blocks, all the good stuff basically, are all listed as appendices, which, I mean, if you're going to have 50 pages of appendices, I would probably just look at adding additional chapters of the actual book, because I don't think you can have an appendix section that's as big as the book itself. That gets a little awkward. It's an extremely professionally organized and designed source book. Absolutely gorgeous use of illustration. There's full page art, there's half page art, there's sidebar art, there's inserts, there's pull quotes, there's little thematic like invoices that have stamps on them, presumably about people gathering the information for this book. All of that is really well done, very well organized. I have a few quibbles about it regarding the lore part of the book. It leans a little too hard on almost a bit of a boring history lesson rather than like interesting stuff that I can use in a campaign, for example. And then on the player side, I like most of it except for the subclasses are a little too boring and mundane, but I really, really love the feats, the magic items, the spells, the creatures, all of that stuff is good content. So it's not, it didn't quite blow me away like the source book we just had last week, but I am still very, very positive. And obviously, if you're at all interested in any kind of information or thematic use of the god of the hunt, then this would be a very big recommendation. I'm going to kind of go through, especially the first half, pretty quickly because it is over 100 pages, and a lot of what you see in the beginning is purely informative. So it's not really for me to there's no balancing things for me to comment on, or if I think it's cool mechanically. It's just kind of reciting a lot of lore and information from D&D, and I assume this author knows what they're talking about because I certainly don't. So and there's even a bibliography listed at the end. There's an index, there's a section of illustrated credits, so all the different artwork, whether it's stock art or whatever is used, is listed at the end, and there's an entire bibliography for further reading, or presumably where the author drew a lot of this content from. That's really impressive. I never see anything on the DM's Guild include, usually don't include any of those 3, let alone including all 3 of those: index, illustrative credits, and a bibliography. So that's really cool to see. And again, I absolutely love the layout here. The font is, very classic D&D with the way the pages are organized. Really great use of artwork and poems, insert art, sidebar art, just good stuff throughout. Writing wise, I'm just not super interested in how much of a deep dive it goes into. I mean, I don't see any player character honestly following Malar. It seems like that's a very slippery slope because you have to be essentially evil aligned. And there is notes, and I think there are actually notes in here about the fact that an evil character, wouldn't necessarily like kick puppies. In fact, for Malar, they would probably like train those puppies up to be hunters. So there is a way you can be a follower of an evil god and not be a toxic pain in the ass player, I guess, for everybody else. Uh, it's still a very fine line to walk, and it's something I would be very reluctant to grant any player unless I was already very comfortable with them and their play style and how they wanted to actually present this character. It seems like more of what this would be used for would be a villainous NPC faction, which that I can totally get behind. And for that reason, these things are kind of cool. So it sets up a lot of like events and rituals and things that you could have occurring that the players could then run into or run afoul of. And find all these poems and things like written in blood, like that kind of thing, I think would be more applicable and useful. So for that reason, I do think it's pretty cool that we get a lot of this information, but it's also a lot of this information. The most useful part of that one is, I think, in these first two chapters, where it really goes over the culture and the hierarchy and the doctrines of the cult of Malar. There's even like some phrases that they use. What are the tenets? How do they greet each other? What are some taboos? Like that stuff is all really interesting. It's very succinctly provided here in these first two chapters. Chapter 3 is where the source book kind of loses me a little bit. It's supposed to be kind of a geographical look at where the cult has done what, but it honestly just kind of reads like a history book. It's kind of like this happened at this location in this region and this certain year with these certain characters, and none of that is a particularly interesting read for me. It just feels like it's a lot of proper names, a lot of proper nouns, and it very few of was I really engaged with. And I think a good source book gets me excited to use the material and starts having my imagination work and how I can then use this material and apply it to an actual campaign. But this stuff is more like just a history book. It's like, here's what happened here. But there's there's not a whole lot of like current NPCs or current events or happenings that I felt like I could actually use in all of these areas. So instead, it's just kind of an interesting like historical lesson on the Forgotten Realms, because it literally does, and I like the way it's organized too, is by area. So it's got like Everesca and like the Icewind Dale region and the Sword Coast, Moonshae Isles. It just ends up being kind of an interesting look at like the Forgotten Realms history in general, with obviously tied to things that have to do with Malar. But in terms of actually using it in a campaign, I don't know how much I would actually use any of this information. And plus, I mean, how much are you really going to need to use all of this information in a campaign? You're most likely going to be centralized in like one area or one region. So I would have rather maybe picked like fewer areas and given more of like okay, here's like a faction operating in this region, and here's possible like plot hooks that you could do in this area and that thing. Now it does list plot hooks in a whole nother area, which is really cool to see. And that's the thing I do like to see. But this chapter in general, I just wasn't really compelled like I was with the earlier one that involved, more of the culture of the cult, and this one is really just a history lesson, and it's just not. It's interesting from a history standpoint, but not too interesting from okay, I want to use this in my campaign standpoint, if that makes sense. Same thing with the Friends and Foes chapter. Again, it's like a history lesson. It just goes over a lot of the once prominent figures in Malar, the cult of Malar's history, and even it mentions like the warring gods and this cool like tripod tentacled creature, which is really neat that the Malar is trying to use to like wipe out the elves and all this. I mean, that stuff can be interesting, but for the most part, I would have rather seen like use sample NPCs that I could actually use in a current campaign. So give me an example of a Lycan tracker, or give me an example of a what do they use, a cult hunt master or something of those lines. Like that would have been really interesting to see, I feel like. We go to. I'm actually going to kind of skip by all these. Role playing notes are good to see. Okay, appendix. So as you see here, that was 50 pages of just pure lore, and half of it was I didn't too care for it that much. The appendices, however, is got some good stuff in it. Starts with probably the weakest thing for me, which is the actually I guess the backgrounds are the first one, which are both pretty good. The new subclasses I'm not super into, unfortunately. There's only two. One of them is for cleric, and then one's for druid, which is odd. You think ranger would be one of them, and they're both just obviously themed towards beasts because this is the Beastlord. Neither of them are that interesting or exciting. They're both very mundane, and they kind of play it safe. The cleric one is basically like, hey, do you want to get some druid in your cleric? And then the druid one, really, I think there was a missed opportunity here. It's like here's some spells that use the new spells we have in the book, which that's fine. And then there's a few new abilities which are like you're immune to being frightened by beasts and that kind of thing. I think there was a huge missed opportunity to really create a cool bestial druid class. Like give me like the ability, maybe strip their wild shape down to only being able to wild shape into a were creature, but then maybe they have like extra abilities with that one were form, or maybe they go berserk while they're in that form and they smell blood and they have this kind of berserker rage. Like you could do a lot of really cool, interesting things that's just not seen here at all. So neither of these subclasses are very interesting. I was actually really disappointed in this because I thought there was some really good use that you could do. And same with like a ranger, you could have like a lycanthrope hunter or a beast hunter and make it a really cool, interesting entire subclass, but it's just not to be found here. But what is interesting, thankfully, the feats, the spells, and the magic items are all really cool looking. I enjoyed pretty much all of them, I think. The feats let you really embrace your lycanthropy, for example, pack hunter, guardian, howl of the blood moon, blood rage. These are all very highly thematic to being a bestial hunter, or you could be a hunter of beasts, specifically like a lycan tracker, lycan hunter. I picture Underworld every time I hear Lycan. But I like the feats a lot. They make sense with the new mechanics that are used here. The spells, same thing. A lot of good thematically appropriate spells. You can summon creatures. You can give yourself bloodlust. You can add a bleeding effect to your attacks. All of these are very appropriate and cool. I particularly like the Spectral Periton, which fires a Spectral Periton that grabs somebody in front of you, lifts them up 20 feet and backwards 10 feet, and then drops them. But the act of doing that, which lasts a whole turn, so I guess the creature can try to ungrapple itself, but then it falls 20 feet. Just being able to move somebody back 10 feet is a big plus, and then put them 20 feet up in the air to add falling damage. Like that's actually really cool and adds a lot of really interesting gameplay effects. So I think that's a really neat idea there. Spectral Stag, which just acts as like a lightning bolt that happens to be a giant moose. It's a neat effect. So I like the new spells. The magic items, I think, also similarly very cool themed. New bracers, new collar, new, what does it got? Cloaks, cages. These are all have to do with either battling lycanthropes or embracing lycanthropy. There's a really neat claw that's on a talisman that you can graft onto your own hand as your hand is severed. That's a really neat effect. I do like all these magic items for the most part. I was impressed with the quality and quantity of both of these, of all of the list of these things, spells, the items, all of this. It's amazing how much mileage the author got out of just this one central theme of like the Lord of the Hunt. So I was very impressed with these. Creatures are pretty good. They're, for the most part, these new cultists of Malar, as well as new variants of lycanthropy. I was a bit disappointed because lycanthropy is such a big part of Malar that there's not like a whole chapter on it for starters, and that we're not given some more interesting player rules on lycanthropy, because I think that lycanthropy is included. It is included in the monster manual, but the the way they do player character lycanthropy is very underdeveloped and very imbalanced, where I really think there needs to be another pass on it. And this would have been a great opportunity. A source book about Malar would have been perfect to really take apart lycanthropy and rebuild it into something that uh, doesn't completely break the game. And I would have loved to see like additional rules. Honestly, a whole chapter on lycanthropy would have been very nice to see here. Instead, all we get are basically half a dozen new variants, where ape, where badger, where fox, and then just these little notes on if you want to do as a player character as a lycanthrope, which just reskins like the existing one. So I was really disappointed here because I thought, okay, finally we're going to get some really cool notes and information mechanically on running player character lycanthropes, and we just didn't get that here, which is another missed opportunity. I do like the sample encounters, which is nice, from tier 1 up to tier 3, which uses all the new creatures here, which is cool. Wolf Spawn, which is, again, the underworld reference here. It cross between, I think it's a werewolf that's been turned by a vampire, so obviously underworld influences there. Some new crazy powerful creatures, even some diseases and drugs, again, all specifically for lycanthrope, so like anti lycanthrope, bombs and poisons and these things. So that theme is stretched so far and so impressively. It's amazing you can get 100 pages of content out of here, but you definitely can. And here's what I'm talking about with the index, credits, and bibliography. So very cool to see. I just have some mixed reservations about it, but let's go over my pros and cons for Malar, the Beastlord Compendium. Pro, professionally designed, organized, and illustrated. Very, very impressed with the actual layout that is used here. Pro, nearly 50 pages of Malar and Malar cultist lore, including history, geography, doctrines, tenets, and rites. This is your one-stop shop for Malar information, I think. Pro, new feats, spells, and magic items themed for bestial hunters and hunters of beasts. I put that in the pro section, specifically those, because I do really think they're very well done, and I'm impressed with how well that theme is used and carried throughout the use of all of those spells and feats and magic items. So very cool to see. Cons, the new subclasses, whereas I liked a lot of the things in the player options section, the subclasses are a little too mundane and simplistic and boring and straightforward. I just think that there could have been so many cool extra things you could have done to make them more interesting, and it really just plays it safe, a little safer than I would have liked. And I appreciate that a lot of subclasses, the tendency is to make them too cool and too powerful, and you have to bring that back down as a DM. So I appreciate when it comes in and it's not that at all, but you risk going in the other direction where it's just a little too boring and not really interesting enough. And then con, the source book about Malar needed a lot more lycanthropy than just a few variants. It needed a whole chapter on there. I wanted to see new mechanics. I wanted to see a lot more of that used. Final verdict, if you're looking for detailed history and lore about the Beastlord, as well as themed spells, items, and feats, Malar, the Beastlord Compendium has you covered. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.